More and more games in the indie world are diving into the rogue genre, especially roguelite, where you do runs of the gameplay until you die and can get permanent upgrades to make future runs easier. What we're covering today is actually something I covered on the Steam Deck quite a while back. A first-person shooter with Doom-like aesthetic and the ability to have an arsenal of a bunch of weapons all at the same time. Here is my review of Vampire Hunters for the Nintendo Switch. When it comes to gameplay, this is a first-person shooter roguelite survival game. As you play, you go through first-person shooting gameplay against increasing hordes of enemies, going and going until you die. With the Switch version, the first thing I noticed was that not all controllers are supported with this game. Joy-Cons will work fine, as well as handheld mode and anything that emulates it like the Hori Split Pad Pro line. But if you use any sort of peripherals that use the Pro Controller's USB controller setting, like the Nitro Deck Plus, or the 8-bit Do USB adapter to connect Xbox and PlayStation controllers to your Switch, those will not work. When you boot the game up, nothing will respond. You cannot navigate the main menu or even exit the game without connecting Joy-Cons properly. If this happens to you, I highly suggest you connect Joy-Cons to safely leave the game. If you don't and power the system off, it'll mess up the Switch for a while, as you can see here, constantly swapping power cords on and off for a few minutes after the reboot. Thankfully, I've contacted the developer about this issue and they are going to add Pro Controller support in the future. Beyond that, Vampire Hunters on Switch seems to be caught up with the PC release in terms of content. When you go into the game, you got two modes you can play. Survivor mode is set by default, which is the new gameplay mode they added after the initial launch. You can also change to Classic mode, giving you the hallway stages that the game initially came out with. Survivors mode is the more beefy, so let's dive into that first. This has you going into an arena map where enemies spawn from all over. You start with a basic weapon of your choice, and as you defeat enemies and collect souls, you will level up, giving you choices of upgrades. Some of these can be new weapons, upgrades to your current weapons, or little relics and passive buffs, like increased damage, running speed, critical chance, etc. This is basically just survival mode. As you fight enemies and upgrade yourself, more enemies show up, new enemy types, bosses, groups of bosses, and your goal here is just to survive as long as possible until the hordes become too much for you to handle. The way this works is very rogue already, and it gets more so when you die and set up your loadout. So let's talk about that. When you first start the game, you choose a character and loadout, each character having different strengths like damage, speed, or health. The initial scout is fast and has a little dashing ability but has no way of healing, while the paladin does lower damage at the start but has more healing options and a ground pound for area damage. You also get a loadout of weapons and enhancements. You can unlock different weapons to start out with, from generic guns like a shotgun or sniper rifle to character-specific ones, like the Paladin's Lightbringer machine gun. You've got constellations and artifacts as well. Constellations are passive skills you can unlock through achievements. They can restrict and enhance your gameplay at the same time, like giving you a one-time revive when you die while lowering your total score amount by 10%. And artifacts are equipable items that will give you stat buffs, like more health or shields. These are obtained through your character's skill tree. That brings us to progression through death. When you die and fail a run, you keep skill and upgrade points that you earned. Each character has their own skill tree to get special enhancements like artifacts or other passive buffs that you either equip or are always there. Then you have permanent upgrades that use a different currency you earn as you play that apply to all characters you can use, giving you more basic and generic things like enhancing damage or maximum HP. And that brings us to the fact that this game is, as it should be, very difficult. Each run starts off pretty simple with you only having a few enemies to contend with, but the more time goes by, the more show up. 5 enemies at a time turns into 10, 20, 30, 40, and then a boss shows up. Eventually, it's 50 enemies and 2 bosses roaming around, and it keeps going the longer you survive. While Classic mode with its hallway format does intend for you to survive until the end of the stage, Survivor mode is simply that. Survive until you can't. Though there is progression here. The game has many stages, and to unlock future stages, you simply need to survive the previous one for a certain amount of time. Survive 8 minutes in the Brotherhood Chateau and you unlock the Corrupted Necropolis. Survive 12 minutes there and you unlock stage 3, and you just keep going and going until you have everything unlocked. The game also gives you more options the more you play. You don't get that many artifacts and upgrades at the start for level ups. As you get achievements done and keep fighting through stages, you will eventually unlock new artifacts and relics for future runs. Reaching level milestones with characters will also enhance your arsenal, unlocking newer weapons for them that you don't have to buy with the currencies you'll want to keep for skill trees and upgrades. As you'd expect, the gameplay is the driving force of the game, and it's admittedly a lot of fun. Each run will start a bit slow with you having to work to defeat even the lowly grunts, but as you build that arsenal, it becomes wacky, ridiculous, absurd fun. Seeing the scout having a combination of submachine guns, missile launchers, shotguns, and swords all at the same time is crazy. And it feels great if you're a paladin and limit yourself to just the Lightbringer, upgrading it to the point where the enemies it struggled with before are just exploding into pools of blood upon contact. That brings us to content and length. There is a lot to dive through here. Classic or Survivor mode, you will be repeating runs again and again to progress enough to finally beat a stage, let alone the entire game. When I'd played the game for nearly 10 hours, I'd barely unlocked a couple stages in Survivors and was still working on stage 1 of Classic mode. If you want to master this system and unlock everything, it's going to take a lot of time. Next up is presentation, and well, downgrades were expected. Visually, I think the game looks okay at best. From the character select screen, you can see the downgraded textures and fuzzy graphics, and that's there in gameplay too. It looks like they lowered the resolution down really far. Everything that you see in the game's engine looks fuzzy in motion. It's not as bad in handheld mode, but it's hard not to notice it. This was clearly for the sake of performance, and for a good bit of the game, Vampire Hunters does run well. It's mostly a range of 30 to 60 FPS. At least at the beginning of each run. When you get about 5-10 minutes into a run and the enemy hordes become absolutely massive, the game will start to dip underneath 30 FPS and you'll get slowdown. This starts in little chunks in the Brother Chateau stage, but the further you go, the worse it gets. When you start getting multiple bosses showing up, the game really struggles to run on the Switch. I had this happen in stage 2 when I was fighting 3 to 5 bosses all at once. And the game was in so much slowdown, I couldn't even use the Paladin's ground pound ability. I had to mash the A button in midair for multiple seconds at a time for the game to even register I was hitting the A button in the first place. That brings us to battery life, which is relatively standard. On the original and light models, Vampire Hunters gets about 2 to 3.5 hours, while the V2 and OLED models get 5 to 6 hours. In conclusion, Vampire Hunters brings its absurd shooting gameplay to Switch, pitting you against massive legions of vampires while holding and using an entire armory worth of weapons at the same time. Now, the downside, the game has performance issues when you get into later parts of each run, and the visuals certainly took a big hit when this game came to the Switch. But if you can adjust to the extreme slowdown when you get almost half a dozen bosses on screen at once, it's still a fun and wacky little shooter to kill time with. Reviews to Go rates Vampire Hunters for the Nintendo Switch a 6.5 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thank you for watching, and have a great day.